Alita, Battle Angel. Now, I have never read the original Alita, Battle Angel manga. It was first published in 1991 under the name Gunnm, Gunnm. It came out when I would have been 5 years old in 1991, turning 6 at the beginning of the autumn that year. So very young. And anime and manga were still a long way from reaching their peak among North American audiences. There were some around, but it hadn't gained a huge following. Like many American kids, my first exposure to anime that I was actually invested in, knowing it was of the Japanimation anime origin genre. I mean, it's not really a genre in itself, but kind of treated as one sometimes. So the first I was actually invested in was Pokemon. Like a lot of American kids, I had seen a little bit of other anime shows before, but the early 2000s, I was watching shows like Disney's House of Mouse, Jackie Chan Adventures, and Xiaolin Showdown, which that latter one, Xiaolin Showdown, is interesting because it was created by Christy Hui, who wanted a kind of blend of Western and Japanese animation, although it's done in a much more simple art form than something like Avatar: The Last Airbender, which came out, which began a few years later. It was good as the show was. I enjoyed it. It really wasn't until series like Inuyasha and Death Note were aired late at night on Adult Swim that I really got into the anime genre. Again, not really a genre in the technical term of the technical sense of what a genre is, but oh well. And I've not become the biggest anime fan since, but certainly a fan of many aspects of the anime style of art and storytelling. And over the past few years, I've started collecting manga. So when I saw the movie posters for this, I didn't really ever see a trailer before going to see the movie. But plenty of posters around in theaters. I recognized the title as anime, having fleetingly come across it before, but never looked into it. I'm now motivated to go and read the original story. I did look it up, and the movie is surprisingly very faithful to the original manga. That's pretty rare, as we'll talk about near the end of the review. Usually, live action adaptations of anime stories tend to try to distort the original story into a couple-hour movie time frame, and they have to make so many changes it doesn't work at all. Not here. Now, this movie is not exact. It doesn't exactly cover the entire original story. The manga does continue the story to the main girl, whose name is Alita. Her name was actually Gally in the original, OVA at least. And I'm not sure how the original title of Gunnm translated to Battle Angel Alita. Apparently it went through some process of name change. I don't know the details as to that, but it's the girl. Her name is Alita, and the story in the manga goes up to her, continues on to her going up to this floating city, not as awesome as Laputa, but the floating city called Zalem that is apparently there were a lot of cities in the air, a lot of floating cities. They're not exactly floating. They're held up by what look like cables, although that structure doesn't really work. I think they're held up actually by something else. I think the cables you see are a way to send things up and down. I don't think that's what's actually holding the city up. Anyway, she, in the manga, goes up to confront Nova, then another antagonist afterwards. It's 9 volumes. So that's a relatively short series. But if I can find manga volumes of Alita that I can actually afford, I do want to get them one day. This is a cyberpunk genre story that takes place on a post-apocalyptic Earth where 300 years before, there was a war against Martian warriors who had advanced technology. That history isn't explored that much. Somehow, the war did not end with the denizens of either planet really winning, as far as I could tell, but the Earth was torched and took centuries to recover. So there were these floating cities held up by some sort of repulsor lift. That's the Star Wars term for anti-gravity technology. Again, all that and how that originated and the details of the war not explained. It's 300 years in the past. All of that is really more to give the setting in which the story is opening than anything else. Now, in the floating cities, of which there's only one left, called Zalem, there are people living some sort of what we think is a paradise-like life, but that's another aspect we never really learn much detail about, and not at all in this movie. Maybe it's detailed in the manga, I don't know yet. But the film opens with a character who seems to be a scavenger picking through garbage piles, very similar to the ones on Earth in Wall-E. He finds the head of a robot girl whose brain is still active, still alive, takes her home and rebuilds her. And that scene where she wakes up in the movie was very interesting for me because not knowing anything about the original story, I wasn't sure whether she was supposed to have been a robot from the beginning, from her origin, or whether she ever was fully human once. Now, I suspect the latter. I suspect she did have an organic human birth at some point in the past. We never really find out. Although there don't seem to be a lot of just pure humanoid robots. You know, there's no like C-3POs in this world. There's no iRobot kind of characters in this world. I think they're all cyborgs to some extent, except for what you would clearly define as these kind of, I don't want to say appliance robots, but these kind of service robots, or in the OVA, there's a little robot register clerk thing that literally looks like just a stick with human eyes and mouth and hands, and I think things like that are the only full robots in this world. I'm not sure, but I think everyone who looks human was at some point at least part human. It's the funny thing is, full humans who haven't had any part of their body refitted or replaced with cybernetics seem to be the minority, actually. The majority are cyborgs, and so clearly this means this is a very violent world, because a lot of people need replacement parts, and there's even a black market. I think there's both a legit market and a black market in both robot parts and human parts. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So people whose bodies are damaged or destroyed can be maintained alive by giving them cyborg bodies, connecting their heads and at least some portion of their nervous system into a robot body. I think, just in my amateur opinion, you would need more than just your head to stay alive. Even if it's not explained how this cyber organic body works so well in this world. We'll just sort of take it that technology advanced to that it went in that direction, and the cyberpunk genre, of course, creates the setting, creates the environment where you can just buy that. There's a very bloody market in human body parts, and why that is never actually explained, because you don't really see humans getting organic replacement parts, you just see them getting cybernetics. In the OVA, it said that orders for organic human body parts like eyes and intestines and lungs and other organs, we don't know the whole range, orders for these come from Zalem. But the nature of what is done with them is not explored at all. In fact, by the end of both the OVA and this new movie, we still really know absolutely nothing about what that floating city is like. We know that it is very tyrannical in some pretty significant ways. For example, anyone who tries to climb up the cables connecting the ground to Zalem is sliced to pieces by this spiked defense wheel that, even in an old cartoon, even in the OVA, where, which came out in the late 80s, early 90s, even in that simple art, that defense wheel still looks pretty nasty. Not to mention what it looks like in the movie release now. And flying machines are outlawed to the point of building one is a death sentence, as are many other things. And in fact, in the original story, the boy that Alita gains a crush on has quite the tearjerker backstory, involving his older brother who tried to build a hot air balloon. We don't get that in the movie, though we get most other plots involving him and his story. It's interesting that even though most people and most humans in this world are, to some part, cyborgs, living on the surface, have no real knowledge of what Zalem is like, but they have this image of paradise in their mind that they're willing to go to huge lengths to even have a spark of hope of getting to someday. Now, we, the viewers, have, few and far between as they are, enough pieces of evidence to suspect that it's not the paradise everyone believes it is. In the OVA, I think OVA stands for Original Video Adaptation. That would make the most sense. Which is the only version I can compare to the film right now, because I haven't read the manga. I did watch the OVA. The surface world really does look like a dystopian scrapyard, which was the idea. Whereas in the movie it does, but it still seems it has some enjoyment to it. There's a game called Motorball, and even a Gladiator, sort of a mishmash of a gladiator, racing, hockey, free-for-all sport that pro players can make a good living off playing. Still has a lot of aspects of a true dystopia, though the plot involving there being no such thing as police anymore, and so criminals, or what appears to be in reality anyone the authority on Zalem, there's an authority of some kind. There's clearly a hierarchy of some kind. We only see a layer or two in the on the surface world. There's the hunter warriors, effectively bounty hunters. In fact, the OVA even says that means the same thing. Are are what passes for law enforcement, and there's an overseer of the surface world. There's a hierarchy of some kind, and so anyone this hierarchy labels as undesirable becomes a criminal as far as anyone is really concerned. A bounty is placed on them, and bounty hunters, the hunter warriors, go after them. And a good deal of conflict in the story is created when Alita herself decides to become one. And I won't really go into the motivations. It's a little obscure, but that's better explained by just watching the movie or OVA or both. Watch both. She defeats one of the cyborgs who kills this little dog. In the OVA, it's a puppy that bonds with Gally herself, or Alita, as she's called. I mean, strange, I do think Alita's a better name. I wonder why she was originally called Gally. Anyway, so this cyborg, this really violent thug cyborg, comes to challenge her. He kills this puppy that in the OVA bonded with her. In the film, it's the most innocent pet of another hunter warrior. What I like about the movie is it spends some time showing Alita actually lose fights before she becomes the badass that Gally was in the original story. I don't think Gally in the OVA actually loses any fights. Maybe one in the beginning? I don't think so. So this movie actually shows some development, and the death of the dog in both stories is one of the major motivators for her toughening up. And the movie actually has her losing her first conflict with this super violent cyborg. In fact, it's very interesting and a nice aspect of the story that Alita spends some time as, albeit a cyborg, but otherwise normal human girl before going through the experiences that gradually forge her transformation into the so-called battle angel. And what's very well done is that they are believable and also intertwined with her forming a relationship with the boy Hugo. Now, I did watch Doug and Rob's Sibling Rivalry review of the movie. They loved it, but they said that the OVA had a stronger emotional ending. And after having watched the OVA, I don't know. I don't think it was more emotional than the films. There's a little bit with Balloon at the end, but it's very short. I didn't really feel any more emotion than I did in the film. I also disagree with them in that the film should have been a little darker and bloodier. I think it fit as it is. I didn't see anything in the OVA that was really specifically more brutal than the live-action movie. Maybe the manga is considerably darker. I will have to try to get my hands on it someday, not too far in the future, if I can find a set that I can actually afford. Money's tight right now. If I could change one thing in the film, I would actually have liked Alita and Yugo's relationship to get a bit more serious. In the OVA, they kiss, and seriously, in fact, their relationship is kind of edgy. Not really edgy, but they treat it with a seriousness and a gravity that I don't really get in the film, except for maybe in the end, whereas there are several scenes in the OVA where they're talking very seriously. In the film, Alita offers Hugo her heart in a very naive and childish tone, whereas the relationship in the OVA, though naive, was much more tied to their motivations and more it was much more what you would expect of in a dark cyberpunk, where the movie the movie was a bit more playful, which kind of fit the movie's tone, but I'd have liked that aspect to go a little bit farther in the dark areas before, even before the ending. In any case, I loved this movie. I think after such a sad history of completely botched anime to live action adaptation attempts, it's awesome to see a film that did that adaptation from a manga and an anime to live action and actually worked. And I think the reason it worked so well is because, for one, it's adapting a short manga and anime. The makers did not try to adapt a 26 episode series or a 3-season story that's anything like, or anything like that, for which obvious reasons can't work. And second, it stays loyal to almost every part of the original story. It has a bit of a mishmash of the manga and the original video adaptation, I've heard, and what it does add that neither of those had, like the time Alita spends as a normal girl before turning into any kind of badass, into much more the original character, only adds to the story, only adds to the development. I'd have only liked the relationship to go just a little bit more serious before the whole turning point at the end. But that's a small nitpick. So if you're an anime fan, and especially if you're a fan of the source material, go see this movie. It's totally worth it. It's amazing. You know what? If you have the time, watch the OVA first. I'm sure someone has it uploaded somewhere. It's only two half-hour long parts, and then go see the film. You'll be amazed and overjoyed with how faithful this is to the source story. This is how you do a good live-action anime adaptation.